Hey out there once again, people. Welcome back to the hallway. Nick Cicada here, coming at you live, coming at you fresh and spicy, with an interesting subject for today's video. Now, obviously, I've been around the Denver art circuit for quite a while, a good long time, I'd like to consider it, and I've seen a lot of different forms of art. I've tried to expose myself to every medium. I've been in the music circuit. I've even been in the comic circuit. The comic circuit is pretty small, but since I consider comics my primary form of artistic output, the one that has remained consistently fascinating to me throughout my life, I'd feel as if I was robbing myself if I didn't engage with it. So music, comics, I've engaged with the writing scene a little. I've even engaged with like some dance shows that I've gone to. I've tried to expand my palette quite a bit, point being. I've tried to really cram in every conceivable art form. I've been to galleries, I've been to little hole-in-the-wall places, I've been to places with not a very extravagant show, and I've been to extremely extravagant shows. I've tried to really culture myself up. Oddly enough, one thing I've noticed is that I can't seem for the fucking life of me to get into poetry or to care about poetry as an art form or a medium. So in today's video, I'm going to try and diagnose why that might be. It is that out of all the mediums out there, all the potential art forms, poetry seems to be the one that I just don't see that much potential or interesting stuff going on in. And maybe how I can overcome this implicit bias by, I don't know, figuring out some new poems that I like or something. So let's get into it. Why don't I like poetry? So, as far back as I can remember, I've never really liked poetry. I got into comics initially, and then about 4 years ago, I got into music. Now, music I really like. I used to only listen to like rockabilly, 50s type standards, Frank Sinatra. I was very sheltered. So then once I started hearing like MF Doom and Talking Heads and all this shit, a whole new world of sonic possibilities opened up for me, and I was like, wow, there's rap, there's electronic, there's rock, there's industrial. Wow, there's so much fantastic music out there. I really like music. I really like listening to music. I really like exposing myself to new types of music. I'm down with music, I've realized. Big into music and even expressing myself with music. I do like the format that an album provides, and I like the ability of music to bring people together through rhythm and chords and melody. It's so captivating, and it takes a certain level of talent and expertise to pull off convincingly. So I do think that music is a very respectable art form. Poetry, though, has never really been something I'm too fond of. I don't generally read poetry. I don't generally engage with poetry. Someone once asked me, Nick, who are your top 5 favorite poets? And I was barely able to answer any poets, because that's how few poets I'm aware of. I was like, well, I like Edgar Allan Poe. I don't really like his poems. I like his short stories, like Masque of the Red Death or whatever, and I don't even like The Raven. If I had to read an Edgar Allan Poe poem, I'm going for Tamerlane, or I'm going for The Conqueror Worm, or something like that. I think I answered Allen Ginsberg, because I do like Allen Ginsberg quite a bit, and probably my favorite strain of poem is the Beat Generation, because they just have a very nice, free-form, casual type sensibility, and they don't seem too full of themselves, and that's something that I do commonly have against poets. I also answered William S. Burroughs, obviously. He's technically a poet, I guess. I forget what else I answered. Freaking maybe like Robert Frost or something. But point being, I don't know too many poets, and all the poets I answered were male. Whoever asked me this question was like, oh, well, they're all male poets? And I'm like, well, yeah, I don't read any female. I don't read poets generally. Like, the few poets I do know just also happen incidentally to be authors. I don't know any female poets. I'm sure if I did, I'd probably prefer them to the male poets, just because generally I find the female perspective more interesting than the male perspective. But I don't know any female poets either, and I only know like 3 male poets that I read like on a consistent, frequent basis. So you might ask, well, what kind of literature do you engage with, Nick? And the answer would be short stories, preferably horror or science fiction short stories. That's the type of literature that I'm into. I'm not into poets. I'm not into sonnets. I'm not really into haikus. I'm not really into odes or whatever other type forms exist out there. I'm into literature. I'm talking short stories. I'm talking Heinlein. I'm talking Clark. I'm talking frickin' Herbert. I'm talking frickin' Thomas Ligotti. Thomas Ligotti's fucking great. Can't get enough of Thomas Ligotti. I'm also into, like I said, Beat Generation shit. Kerouac, Ginsberg. I like all that stuff. I like so many short story authors, and novelists too. I like novelists also, but generally science fiction, horror, if it falls within that ballpark, I'll be really fucking receptive to it. Because I like sci-fi and horror, I like speculative fiction, I like fiction that dreams of new possibilities and new modes of thought. That kind of thing has always been very appealing to me, will always be very appealing to me, and that's one of the reasons, as you'll see in a moment, why I don't like poetry. Poetry and speculative fiction very rarely intersect, and this is because the idea is exposited with something like science fiction, or best exposited in a short story, in a loose collection of 3,000 to 10,000-ish words that sound good when they're read off the page, a description of a sequence of events, and the flowery, abstract type language that poetry as a medium tends to engender. Not to say that every poem is like that. I don't want to make blanket statements in this video. You have to understand there are some poems, rare exceptions, where I'll like the poem. But for the vast, vast majority, they are so flowery and so abstract that they are incapable of carrying an interesting idea. Like Damon Knight's short story Babel 2, for instance. That probably couldn't be expressed in the form of a poem. That's just an example. I don't know why it is that Babel 2 specifically was the one that rose to the top of my head. I mean, any short story, Damon Knight or otherwise, will really only work as a short story. That's how they're composed and that's how they're meant to be. The Handler by Damon Knight. Way better than Babel 2, I'd argue. Probably Damon Knight's best. Goddamn, wonderful short story. Only would work as a short story. That thing would not work as a poem. There's a reason that Damon Knight is a short story writer and not a poet. One thing I've noticed with Denver, oddly enough, is that there is like this very insular group of poets. And poets are like the primary form of artist, at least with any like vested interest or stake or like real passion. I don't even think most of the musicians have as much dedication to their art form as the poets do. I'm not sure if this is a nationwide thing, but like holy shit, poets don't fuck around. They take what they do very, very seriously, and they just read their poems. I've been to open mics where poets will just get up on stage and read their poems, and this has been going on for decades in Denver. It's nothing new. It's a time-honored tradition. In fact, I think there's one open mic locally that brags about like being one of the longest running open mics ever. It's just been going for decades and decades and decades, and poets will just come in and read their poems in front of a big audience, and everyone claps and everyone's like, wow, poetry time. Yeah! So, as you might expect, the main reason that I'm not so big into poetry, and this just has to do with context and circumstances, maybe if I didn't arise in an environment where everyone is constantly consuming poetry and constantly congratulating each other and patting each other on the ass about how great it is, I'd find a little more to enjoy about it. But as it stands, as a writer of short fiction, and a novelist too now, I mean, I've written a freaking novel this year. I'd written 2 novels before that, but this is like my first really prose, snappy, really exciting novel, and it's like 74,000 words, and I still can't believe that I've even written a novel, but it's like, wow, you know, I'm a novelist now. I can call myself that. I've written a fucking novel. Just kind of have to wonder why aren't short stories or novels given any credit, considering that just like in 9 cases out of 10, they take more effort than a poem does. I don't want to claim, like I said, that there aren't any poems that are good or that take craft. But when everyone's a poet, like everyone here in Denver seems to think that they're a poet and that they're all equally talented, even though they're obviously not. There are a lot of shit poems that I've heard across my time of listening to poems. And they all congratulate each other and go, wow, we're such great poets. We're masters of our craft. And it's like, well, are you really, though? Because I would argue that the key skill in writing a great poem is being able to swish really interesting, profound statements on the human condition or whatever into a shorter form of writing than a short story. Poems typically aren't like 3,000 words like a short story is. They might be like 200, 500-ish words, around that. So they're not going to be able to express all the character and all the dynamic and conflict and narrative of a short story. So the really good poets, like, fucking Edgar Allan Poe and frickin' Whitman and all those, the classics, they have to stuff really interesting ideas into a really small space, and that is a skill. That's a certain skill that not everyone is going to have, and not everyone has, obviously. There are a lot of poets who just think they're the greatest thing, even though the ideas they're expressing are not remotely novel, remotely interesting, not profound. They've been done to death a million bajillion times, and yet they still are like, wow, I wrote a 200-word little ditty. Yippee. I don't mean to reduce or, say that like this doesn't take effort, but as someone who regularly writes long 3,000 word to 74,000 word blocks of text, and that does actually like shave time off my life, like a considerable amount of time. It is a labor of love and a dedication to language. I have to ask, how do poets take themselves this seriously? Because there's just no way they write as much as I do and are able to exposit as many ideas as I'm able to exposit in like a short story or a novel. I guess what it ultimately comes down to is effort, because a lot of people these days are extremely lazy, as you might expect, and poetry is, hands down, though I hate to say it, the medium and the art form with the lowest barrier to entry. Literally all you need is a phone, or fuck it, a pencil and some paper, or anything with which you can write, and you can write a couple words, and bam, you're a poet. If you're a painter, you gotta buy paints. If you're a novelist, you gotta dedicate a couple months of your fucking life to writing a goddamn novel, or you won't have a goddamn novel. You have to actually give a shit. With poets, you can just go, bam, I'm a poet now, and it's just like, well, okay. A lot of people just kind of stop there, and they don't go further. I heard from one poet, hey, how do people even write 3,000 words? That sounds really difficult. Holy shit, 3,000 words about one thing? Oh my gosh. And I was just kind of like, well, it takes about 3 hours, but if you can't spend 3 hours of your day dedicated to some form of art, maybe art just isn't for you. Maybe artistic expression just isn't your forte. If you're so pressed for time, you can't spend 3 hours writing 3,000 words, and that's my rate, but that's about what I can write in that amount of time, then maybe just do something else. I don't know. Why even want to be an artist at that point if you're not willing to invest any time into it? I don't mean to be classist here. You do not need to invest a great deal of money into art to produce some really profound, some really great art, but you do have to invest time into it. That is a commodity you are going to have to ultimately sacrifice if you're legitimately committed to art, to language, to communication, really to anything. You can't skimp out on time. You can't half-ass it. You can't just write 200 words when 3,000 words might be more proficient at expressing the type of idea that you want to express. and it very well might be. You might want to write a 500-word short story, but that's kind of dinky and lame. You might want to go for 5,000. You know, maybe give the reader a little more meat on the bone. Maybe give them a little more to mull over. You know, so they feel like they've got more bang for their buck. And it doesn't cost you anything. Really great art doesn't cost anything. I've seen graffiti on fucking train tracks. You know, it's just like a fucking crayon or a chalk that someone had. It doesn't cost that much. I've seen art that is produced for dimes and nickels that is really profound. It all just depends on who's making it and how vivid their ideas are and how much time they're willing to spend to realize and manifest those ideas. So obviously one reason that maybe I'm not so big into poetry as much as all the other mediums of art is because I'm surrounded by people who constantly insist that they deserve some kind of award or recognition or something just because they write out short little bleeps of language. And as someone who ascribes to a much more concrete, long-form mode of storytelling that takes like way more effort and thought, I just find that a bit unfair. And I find it unfair too that there aren't enough resources for people in my line. Like there aren't any short story open mics, for instance. There are only poetry open mics. There's not an open mic where you can go and read your short story, because a short story that's say like 3,000, 4,000 words, it takes a while to read. It might take like half an hour, 45 minutes, and most people just don't have the fucking attention span for that. Most people aren't willing to gather in a room and read short stories to each other. That's really fucking sad, because it's like one of humanity's basic instincts, and we've been doing it since caveman times. I'm sure back in the good old days, 12,000 BC, Grok would go, "I am to tell this tale of the mammoth tonight," and it would be really long, and the whole Grok family would fall asleep listening to the exciting tale of the mammoth. And it'd be a long fucking story, because they didn't have anything better to do. You know, they didn't have Fallout back in those days. My point being that there are no resources for novelists or short story writers, and that's very inconvenient to me as someone who, just for one reason or another, can't bring myself to classify as a poet. I'm not going to call myself a poet. I've written a couple poems, but they're not good, and every time I try to, I am held back by the abstract, really short type form that poems tend to engender. And I just prefer writing short stories. I prefer writing long tracts of like 3,000 to 10,000 words. So sue me. But there's no outlet, no venue where I can go to read that to a group of people who are willing to listen and give a shit. I've probably talked about this before, but there was one creative writing group I went to, and they had tons of poets there, as was to be expected. And they didn't let you read an entire short story, even if your short story was only like 3,000 words, half an hour. People don't have the attention span for that. I guess they do if it's like a creepypasta on YouTube or whatever, but if it's like in person, they're like, no, just bring 2 pages. So I'd have to bring 2 pages of the same story once a week, every week, and it was just like, it's so awkward to read a short story like that, but into dithy little chunks. Like, you should just be able to read the whole fucking 4,000 words or whatever, and then have it sit with people, and have the full effect, like, sit with them. You shouldn't have to, like, fucking just read, like, 500 words or whatever. But again, this group was run by poets, which is fundamentally the problem, is poets don't understand the conventions and expectations of other mediums, of other forms of art. But for whatever reason, the poets in Denver, again, I don't know if this is a thing nationwide, but the poets in Denver seem to have too many fingers and too many pies. I've been to open mics that are ostensibly for music, people who make songs, and they're run by poets. They're hosted by poets, and it's like, I don't really trust that you're going to master the sound the best. I don't really trust you're going to, like, give a shit about, like, audio quality. Just generally, I'm not sure that, you know, you have my best interest in mind, really, if you're a poet and you're hosting an open mic which is for musicians. As a musician, I want to be sure that the people who are curating my music and presenting it to an audience also do what I do and understand the craft and understand the process and all that. Which, you know, again, this all just ties back to that I feel like I have no fucking peers in this city. Where's the novelists? There's so many poets. You know, where's the novelists? Where's the Kurt Vonnegut of Denver? You know, where's he? I don't see him too much. I don't really see too many local novelists who get like crazy acclaim, you know, lots of praise, lots of celebration. Oh damn, he wrote an 80,000 word novel, isn't that cool? Oh no, he wrote a 50-word poem. Wow, he's so much cooler. Just like, you know, there's no resources for novelists here. One reason I don't like poems, though, and this is an entirely different reason, but I think it's equally as prominent, is that poems lend themselves obviously to romance. Since time immemorial, it could be argued poems are the most romantic form of art. Shakespeare and Byron and all of that, they're about love more than any other form of art, I think. There's so many poems about relationships and having a girlfriend or having a boyfriend or getting married or whatever. And as you might expect, as an aromantic, I don't care about any of this. It's completely irrelevant to my life, and I find it very repetitive and boring. I think there's something specifically encoded into the structure and form of poetry itself that lends itself to romantic themes. I think that poetry, being a lot more flowery and elaborate and pithy than other forms of art, which are oftentimes more straightforward, a lot more literal, there's a lot less posing, a lot less posturing, they tend to go with romance really well. I've said in the past that I dislike romance because it requires the forfeiture of rational thought, and it operates on kind of the same premise as religion, in that you give yourself over to some kind of cosmic idea or something. As someone who is insanely rational, like rational to an extent that I actually believe is unhealthy, I can't bring myself to do that. So in much the same way that I don't prefer romantic type behavior because it's full of lies and like insane promises and hyperbolic statements like, ooh, this romance is the greatest romance that's ever existed, or something that's obviously just not true like that. I can't really bring myself to like poetry because it seems so theatric and full of itself and just like pretentious. Obviously, that's not the case for all poets. Like I said, I do like the Beat Generation poets quite a bit because they have a very free-form, spontaneous way of delivery that's a lot more down-to-earth, a lot more grounded. I don't really get the feeling that, like, listening to Kerouac or someone, I'd come away with the impression that he was like a narcissist or anything. But and some of the more romantic ones from like the the Romantic Age or whatever, I read that and I'm just like, this is fucking soup. This is just pithy drivel right here. This is just total schlock. I think many poets assume that short stories don't have like a voice, that they're not emotive. In some ways that they're not imbued with humanity in the same way that a poem is, and I just like to say, like, anyone who thinks like that has obviously never read a short story in their fucking life, because every single author of like short stories writes short stories in a very different way, even if they are more narrative, even if they are descriptions and accounts of events that happen with characters. They're going to be described. The adjectives and the adverbs and all of that are going to be vastly different. I'd be really interested if there was like a story with the same general characters, the same like plot synopsis, but like 50 different short story writers all took a jab at it, and you'd see vastly different results. Like obviously, a frickin' Ernest Hemingway is going to write so much different than a fucking Thomas Ligotti, even if they're both just writing about like a bus driver or something. They're going to describe this bus driver in such different terms, like such vastly different ways. And that's because short stories, even though they're a little more objective than poems and they have a lot less flowery bullshit, they're still very, very descriptive, arguably more so because you do have to kind of take some effort to describe a scene vividly, all the smells, all the sights, all the feelings and sounds, and really transport your reader to that time and place. And that takes a great deal of effort and giving a shit. The type which most poets, at least like not professional poets, like these amateurs that think they're like the hottest shit on the block, just really can't. Like they can't express themselves with that degree of eloquence. There are so many open mics I've been to where someone will just get up on stage and they'll just recite their sexual hang-ups or their problems with their relationships. And as someone who doesn't experience romantic attraction or sexual attraction, I just feel like this is a venting session. I don't feel like it's even poetry at that point. I've heard a poem where someone gets up on stage and he's just like, "Ooh, you won't let me make out in front of your whole family, but our love is special, and it transcends everything, and it is everything, and it's the universe, and oh my god, it's beautiful. Oh my god, this hormonal exchange is so pretty, and dainty, and wonderful, and beautiful, and you just don't get it." Oftentimes, the poets will be like these fuckboys. There aren't even that many female poets, I don't think, in the Denver poetry circuit, at least not the one that I'm familiar with. 95% of them are men. And so there's lots of guys that think that by becoming a poet, they'll be more sensitive, they'll be more appealing to the women, more emotionally vulnerable, and then they'll get to have sex. So it's like this guy gets up and he just like reads crap. He just reads this total crap that's like, "I like to fuck it, and I like to suck it, and dick it, and lick it, and I'm from Nantucket." It's a bit exaggerative, but sometimes I have heard poems that are just like that empty, and are just like, "I like having sex," from this guy who I guess likes having sex, and I'm just kind of left to wonder, like, am I supposed to give a shit? Am I supposed to care? I don't care. That's not, of course, to say that there aren't poems from girls that sometimes are just as empty and vapid. A lot of times I've been to an open mic where there's some lady poet talking about, "Oh, my vagina, oh, my vagina." For whatever reason, people, when they're, again, limited to just like 50 words, they can't tend to exposit very complex ideas or like really transcendent stuff, so they'll just go for like, "My boyfriend dumped me. My girlfriend dumped me. Damn." Well, you know, that's happened like 5 billion times across the course of the world, so not really bringing anything new to the table here. Like, I don't mind, like, a fucking Prince song or something that's about sex, because it has a pleasing chord progression to my ears. You can make a song about sex or romance that will even appeal to asexuals or aromantics, provided it's catchy enough, it's fun enough to listen to. I feel like a lot of poets could maybe benefit from putting their poem to a song. But again, that takes effort. It takes some effort to put your words to music. It takes some effort to write. It takes effort to do anything, and if you're not willing to invest that, if you're not willing to, like, create art that is engaging, then you won't have art that's engaging. Kind of as simple as that. Like I said, poetry, like romance, requires a suspension of disbelief and a hyperbolic fixation. And poetry probably even requires some kind of pheromonal, hormonal exchange like romance does. Because, my gosh, poets are full of themselves and think they're the best thing since sliced gravy. Much like poetry, romance also kind of sizzles the faculties. As Frank Zappa says in his song, "Love will make your mind go wild." You know, someone who talked about their boyfriend like, "Oh, my boyfriend is the most creative person I know." And it's like, well, but I know you. I'm probably the most creative person you know. I doubt your boyfriend is as creative as me. Your boyfriend might be creative. He's probably not as creative as me. So that's just kind of a lie. It's like saying your boyfriend is the captain of the frickin' Denver Broncos when really he's just the captain of the college football team. It's a denial of objective fact. People might hate me for saying that. You know, I've made a lot of enemies in my time, but one thing can't be denied. I am a clever fucking bastard. I don't understand why someone would say that their boyfriend is the most creative person they know if they know someone who's more creative. It's a nice compliment, but if your boyfriend isn't the most creative person you know, or the greatest athlete, or like the greatest person in general, why lie about it? Just to prove that I don't dislike all poetry, I'm going to read a bit from Naked Lunch here. This is on page 33 of the more modern edition, and this is during the tour with Dr. Binway. And oddly enough, I have a great deal of respect for Naked Lunch because it's one of the very few pieces of literature which dissects and analyzes sexual behavior from a sort of detached, neutral lens. And I think that's incredibly valuable. And I also respect Naked Lunch as kind of a piece of epic poetry in the tradition of the Odyssey or whatever. And this is a section which really spoke to me as an asexual and aromantic, and autistic, of course. Autism is actually even mentioned here, and I didn't even know that autism was like a term in 1959, but I guess it probably was. Morphine calls forth the antidote of back-brain stimulation similar to schizosubstance. Note similarity between withdrawal syndrome and intoxication with Yates or LSD-6. Eventual result of junk use, especially true of heroin addiction where large doses are available to the addict, is permanent back-brain depression and a state much like terminal schizophrenia, complete lack of affect, autism, virtual absence of cerebral event. The addict can spend 8 hours looking at a wall. He is conscious of his surroundings, but they have no emotional connotation, and in consequence no interest. Remembering a period of heavy addiction is like playing back a tape recording of events experienced by the front brain alone. Flat statements of external events. I went to the store and bought some brown sugar. I came home and ate half the box. I took a 3-grain shot, etc. Complete absence of nostalgia in these memories. However, as soon as junk intake falls below par, the withdrawal substance floods the body. If all pleasure is relief from tension, junk affords relief from the whole life process in disconnecting the hypothalamus, which is the center of psychic energy and libido. Some of my learned colleagues, nameless assholes, have suggested that junk derives its euphoric effect from direct stimulation of the orgasm center. It seems more probable that junk suspends the whole cycle of tension, discharge, and rest. The orgasm has no function in the junkie. Boredom, which always indicates an undischarged tension, never troubles the addict. He can look at his shoe for 8 hours. He is only roused to action when the hourglass of junk runs out. Obviously, this passage is really interesting to me for a number of reasons, because I do have an obscenely long attention span. I probably could look at my shoe for 8 hours, and I don't do heroin or anything, obviously, but I do feel like that sometimes. I feel very bored. I lack neural stimulation a lot of the time. I require neural stimulation, but I just don't get it. And I really like how William S. Burroughs, out of all the poets out there, is able to capture how I feel in this little paragraphs here. He's really able to get how it feels for me as somebody who doesn't care about experiencing sexual intercourse or the cycle of tension, discharge, and rest, as he puts it. I also like how he points out that there's a very flat statement of external events, because it could be said that I probably write like that more than other people. I probably write and speak like that with a flat statement of external events. I also don't feel nostalgia either. So what Burroughs is describing there obviously isn't autism. It's heroin addiction, which induces a state, I guess, similar to autism, at least somewhat, but I just find it fascinating. I find it fascinating. That's from 1959. Way better poetry than I've ever heard at any open mic, with a couple exceptions. I'll say that. I have heard some poems on very rare occasions that do get me kind of thinking, but most of it isn't that good. I'll leave you to figure out which of you poets out there I actually like the material of. Hint, it's not anyone who writes about sex or romance all the time. So I guess maybe the reason I don't like poetry so much is because it doesn't require that much effort. At least in the vast majority of cases, there's no effort shown, there's no discipline shown, there's no real interest in the arts to the extent that it would become like a professional thing. I have a great deal of respect for poets who can memorize a piece if they don't have to look at their notes. I mean, if there's a very good poem and the poet is looking at their notes, I don't necessarily mind that. For instance, I don't have all of Naked Lunch memorized. I have to pick it up and read it for you here, and that's fine. But if someone writes something themselves and it's like reasonably long and they have to memorize it, I find that kind of impressive because it takes time and effort and skill to remember something that you've written. I have to do the same thing with song lyrics, obviously, because I'm not just going to look at my sheet of song lyrics while I'm up on stage. You know, I have to commit those to memory. And it might be, in fact, a little more difficult with a poem because it's not designed to rhyme or really stick in the brain as much. There isn't always a catchy hook with poems, so I imagine they're a little more difficult to memorize. If a poet memorizes a poem, then, you know, that's cool. That takes some effort. And if there is a sci-fi poem or a poem about something cool, just generally a cool idea, if there's some overlap between it and spec fiction, which, like I said, happens very rarely, Naked Lunch being one of the only examples, which isn't to say I dislike Howl or On the Road or anything by the other Beat guys, but Naked Lunch is a primo example of sci-fi poetry. Same goes for Nova Express, same goes for The Ticket That Exploded and Soft Machine and all that. I'd say William S. Burroughs is the greatest science fiction poet, probably. There aren't too many. That doesn't happen very often because science fiction is a very cold, clinical, detached, one could even say autistic form of fiction, and it requires the expositing of lots of complex, weird ideas, and poetry is all about mushy, gushy stuff and smooch. Just like more generally abandoning oneself to emotion, which on a general level I can't bring myself to do. Well, anyway, yeah, that's pretty much the full story, the entire context, and why I don't like poetry as much as other forms of art. Not just necessarily because it's more often than not about romantic topics, but also because it doesn't seem to take that much effort. Anyway, Denver's premier novelist, Nick Cicada. My new novel's out now. I don't mean to plug it even, but it's very surreal to think I've written a novel, and I think it's a decent novel. I don't really tend to hype myself up as much as all these poets do. I don't tend to have as grand an ego. I haven't really been given the opportunity to build anything like that up because I'm never given an opportunity to show people what I'm capable of or read any of my short stories in a public setting. So I don't really think that highly of myself because the world generally doesn't appreciate what I have to offer all that much. For what it's worth, I think my novel's pretty impressive, more impressive than a poem about having sex. So read it if you want. Comment if you want. Does your city have a pretentious poets scene? I don't know. It's kind of funny and interesting to think about. Say all that down below, and I'll see you, as always, in the next one. Sporsh.